Shalom Aleichem. Welcome to all. For the record, today is Leil Yov Daled B'Mar Heshwan Tavshin Pei-Wav, according to our calendar, corresponding to the 4th of November 2025, the Neminyan Nisharotze Limanot Kach, those who choose to count time in such terms. Many of us have been thinking a fair amount about the various goings on here in Israel and in other countries, but specifically let's talk about what's going on, what has been going on here in Israel for the last couple of weeks. It was a week ago, which was actually then, that was during the week following reading Parashat Noah, the Parashat of the Mabul, and the Hashhatha of human society. And we have no end of examples of that kind of, those kinds of behavior, those norms, before our eyes, mamash, before our very eyes. None of this is surprising, I imagine, to anybody. And yet, it seems that it was surprising for some, and it therefore is a kind of wake-up call for some people. That's, I suppose, a good thing. And I was thinking about the description of the Torah of corruption and the degeneration of human society that we find already in Parashat Bereshith, which was read in most B'tei Knesset just 2 or 3 weeks ago. What we find there in Perek Shishin, Sefer Bereshit, chapter 6, in Genesis. Ki hahel ha'adam l'rov al panei ha'adama uvanoth yuladu lahem. Came to pass when humankind began to increase in number, and daughters were born to them. That already is a red flag, those words, uvanoth yuladu lahem. Well, that's obvious. Children were born, and some are going to be male and some are going to be female. So what exactly are we being told here? Uvanoth yuladu lahem. But in fact, obviously, what the Torah is telling us is very, very, very profound and very essential that we understand. It will become clearer as we move on to the next pasuk. Pasuk Beth, verse 2. Vayir'u v'nei ha'Elohim eth benot ha'adam ki tovot henna. Certain people referred to here as B'nei ha'Elohim, which it's not clear how that should be translated. It can either be translated very literally as the children of God, or it could be understood as referring to people of a finer, more spiritual nature, as opposed to another class of person who is not so inclined. Because it goes on to say, "Vayiru v'nei ha'Elohim eth benot ha'adam." These women that are being referred to in this pasuk are not benot Elohim apparently; they're benot ha'adam. In other words, they're classified by using a different term. Ki tovot hena, which apparently means, and that's what the Targum says, that they were good looking. Vayikhu lahem noshim mikol asher b'haru. And these people, these men, b'nei ha'Elohim, took from any woman that they chose. Now, what does that mean? That's also not clear. This whole parasha is very brief and very, very enigmatic. The classic and very ancient explanation of these terms is as follows. وَيِرُوا v'nei Elohim, these special people, or the sons of God, or the other interpretation that I didn't mention yet is the sons of the great and the rich and powerful. This is what Targum Onkelos says. وَحَزَوْ v'nei Rav Revaya Yath Banath Enasha. It was the sons of the great, the rich, the powerful, saw the daughters of men, of lesser men, apparently. Arei Shapiran, inin, they are good looking. Unsivu lehon neshim mikol de'itre'iu. And note the language of the Targum does not imply anything at all along the lines of kidnapping or rape or anything of the sort, which some Mefarshim have read into these words. But that's not, first of all, it's not what the word in Hebrew, the Lashon of the Katuv, the Hebrew term, وَيِكْحُ لَهَمْ نَشِيم, is just a term for marriage, right? Nikuchim, Kiddushin. Ki yikah ish isha. It means to marry, it doesn't mean to do anything untoward. And that's what the Targum also says. He says, unsivu lehon. Unsivu means to marry. That's the normal standard term for marriage. So it's not necessarily referring to any improper relationship or some criminal act. Rashi quotes from the Midrash Rabbah, and Rashi says, the Bnei HaElohim refers to Bnei HaSorim Wa-Shofatim, the sons of the powerful, the Sarim, political leaders, and Shofatim, and judges, who are also in a position of power. And there are the same Midrash and a number of Midrashim go on to describe a general degeneration of human society. That's why Rashi, following in the footsteps of such Midrashim, explains, Mikol asher baharu af be'ulat ba'al af hazachur v'habehima. In other words, referring to complete and utter dissolution and depravity. But the truth is, that's not explicitly mentioned or even hinted at in the Lashon of the Torah. The Torah speaks explicitly about Bnei Elohim and Benot HaAdam, and the Bnei Elohim chose as wives. It says Nashim, Waikulehem Nashim. Also, the word Nashim implies it's their married wives, it's their legal wives that they marry, as any man marries a woman. Mikol asher baharu, whomever they chose. In other words, the simple implication is that they were following their eyes, ki tovot henna, and nothing else. Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra also speaks about Bnei Elohim, Bnei Shofatim. And then he goes on to say, Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra, وَيَشْ أَمْرِمْ كِ بْنَيْ Elohim هِمْ بْنَيْ Sheth. In other words, these are two very different explanations, as we shall see. Uvnot ha'adam benot mishpachat Cain, because at this point in time we have the descendants of Cain and we have the descendants of Sheth, right? Cain killed Hevel, correct? So you have the descendants of Cain, and then following that, Adam had another son, Sheth, regarding whom the Torah says explicitly. This is in Perek Hey, one chapter before, and it says at the beginning of chapter 5, وَيَحِي Adam shaloshim u'me'at shana v'yoled bidmutho kesalmo. The pasuk is emphasizing something, that Vayikrat Shemo Sheth. In other words, that Sheth is in some way a continuation of Adam, more apparently than those mentioned before, because earlier it did not say that. It said in Perek Dalet, chapter 4, وَهَذَمْ يَدَعِتْ هَوَا إِشْتَو وَتَاهَرْ وَتَرَدْ أَتْ كَايِن وَتَوْمَرْ, she said, Kanithi Ishet Adonai, which is also a pasuk which needs explanation, but that's not for now. But it doesn't say anything about Tselem, the Muth, doesn't say anything along those lines. وتوصف له ثحي with Havel ويهب الرعيثون وكاين هيا عبيد الظما. It doesn't say anything about Selim Dmut, it doesn't say anything, but all of a sudden with regards to Sheth it says so. And then it goes on to say further, with the descendants of Sheth, where Sheth was Sheth Hamesh Shanim u'Ma'ath Shana ويولدت Enosh. And then we have the list of the descendants of Sheth. And then we have the story that we began with a moment ago. In other words, B'nai Elohim, according to the first Perush, which is what we find in the Targum, which is what we find in Bereshit Rabbah, which is what Rashi quotes, that the B'nai Elohim are the rich and the powerful and the judges. In other words, the people who call the shots, the people who have power over other people. And that, of course, connects entirely and very obviously to the current events here in Israel. As we know, Machon Mishpat Sham Haresha. We know that the easiest place the most obvious place for corruption is the judge, the most obvious target, object of bribery, for example, is a judge. You want a certain outcome, you pay off the judge and you get the outcome that you want. Not everyone has that power to produce that outcome, but the judge has that ability, has that power. And what we see today in Israel, but it's not just in Israel, this is an international phenomenon, as we all know, I think, we should know. This is the case in the United States also, clearly, and in the UK, and everywhere. If you pay attention to news and current events and various things, you see this phenomenon repeats itself everywhere you look. In Israel, it has become very, very obvious and blatant over the past many years. And now it's really coming to the surface in a manner which it previously had not done. But the phenomenon is not new, not at all. So according to this first Pirush, the Bnei Elohim are the judges and their children, etc., etc. So I hardly need to mention, I suppose, the son of the so-called Attorney General, the Yoamashit, who was filmed on camera stealing a bulletproof vest from another that did not belong to him in the army, in a locker room, and it was I suppose he did not know it was being videoed. So it's right there. You see that he takes it. There's no question. And this is an expensive piece of equipment, and it was a piece of private property. It belongs to a particular person who bought it. It actually belonged to a soldier who returned from Chutz La'aretz, from overseas, at the beginning of the war, to fight in the war against the Islamo Nazis. And he bought himself, at his own expense, this bulletproof vest. Ceramic, very expensive. And it disappeared. But we have the proof, we know who did it. This young man happened to be the son of the so-called Attorney General, who has been fired, I think, 2 or 3 times already by the government, but that makes no difference apparently in this country. So she continues to lord over everybody, and it should come as no surprise that he has not been convicted of anything. Now, in actual fact, he was a soldier at the time, so who in actual fact needs to convict him? The military justice system. In other words, a military court. He should have been tried in a military court. And who's in charge of the military justice system, so-called? The lady who the other night pretended to commit suicide and jump off a cliff or go for a swim and disappear, which was all a ruse, as it became obvious very quickly, in order to somehow get rid of her phone, although I'm not sure I understand the connection between the phone and going for a swim, or leaving a bogus suicide note or anything like that. I'm not sure I understand that. If you want to get rid of the phone, you just have to light a little fire and put the phone into the fire, and then the phone will be, anything there will be, I believe, irretrievable. But so I'm not sure I understand all of that. But it was all a ruse, and it was not real. So this woman is the advocate general, so-called, of the military justice system, and she should have put this person on trial, but she didn't. One reason is because she's very friendly with the Attorney General, and it was her son, the Attorney General's son, who stole this equipment. So nothing happened, as everybody knows. This is not news. This happened over a year and a half ago. And it's also clear that one of the reasons this so-called advocate general from the army, the reason that she has somehow caused her phone to disappear is because she's already admitted to doing at least certain things. She's probably done much more, but she's admitted in writing doing certain things which she denied before, not having any knowledge of. So she's most definitely a criminal and a liar, and she's already been fired and what have you, but she's doing what she's doing now to protect the other Bnei Elohim, right? The other judges, the other legal members of the legal mafia. Those referred to as former President Rubi Rivlin as a junta mishpatit. Those were his words, not mine. He said that 22 years ago in an interview in Haaretz newspaper. So we see that this is not a new phenomenon at all. There are the Bnei Elohim, the rich and the powerful, certain politicians and people who populate the upper echelons of the cryptocracy and the plutocracy, otherwise known as a bureaucracy, and then there's everybody else, and the law only applies to everybody else. However, the pasuk does not begin by relating an instance of stealing an item such as a bulletproof vest or anything else, or a ingot of gold or something like that. No, it talks about Bnei Elohim et benot ha'adam vayir'u bnei Elohim et benot ha'adam ki tovot ha'ena. And then it goes on to say that there was a general deterioration in the world. It goes on to say in pasuk Hey, verse 5, Moyar Adonai ki rabba ra'at ha'adam ba'aretz v'chol yasem machshavot libo rak ra' kol hayom. So all of mankind was on a downward spiral, went into a tailspin. But this began with men following their eyes. Bnei Elohim, they saw and took note of and cared essentially for that thing only. Benot ha'adam. This is an important point. But before we continue with this point, there is another. Well, we said there's another pirush. Perhaps I'll read something that I have here to you, and then we'll carry on with the other pirush, which I think is very correct and very, very necessary to fully internalize. This is a pirush of Rabbi Naftali Hertz Weiser, Zichrono Livracha, a very unique individual. He wrote some very interesting sforim. What does he say about these pesukim? He says as follows. Moriah Rav Tzuriah was responsible for bringing this to the printing press. Yes. He says as follows. Ume'az, when this began to be the reality that men, particularly a particular class of men, began to care only about their lustful inclinations. ומאז החל החמאס להתגבר בעולם. This was the initial cause. This was the catalyst for bringing causing the downward spiral of humanity. It began with this emphasis on women. כי אין רע יותר מן האישה. That's what he writes. I hope no feminist will take me to task. I'm just quoting, but that's what it says. And he happens to be correct within the context of this discussion, if you understand what he is saying. וכדברי קהלת, as it says in קהלת, ומוצא אני מר ממוות את האישה, והיא מביאה את האדם אל הרשע ולהוללות. In other words, it's very easy, this reality of the men's attraction to women very easily devolves and degenerates into all manner of resha, of evil and dissolute and depraved behavior. And he says, "V'hinei hodia Torah sibat hishahet haaretz v'shemala hamaas v'shakol garma haisha." It all began with that. In other words, this is a very important statement and statement of musar, of ethics. If you see a society in which this particular aspect of human existence, relations between men and women, in other words, all manner of depravity and promiscuity and adultery and pornography, etc., etc., and when these things are prevalent, ubiquitous aspects of a given human society, even worse today when it's not one society, it's essentially all societies, then you need to know that humanity is in a very, very bad way. Because it's not just that thing itself, which is bad enough in itself, it's because that is an indication and a litmus test for everything else. So in a society where these things are tolerated and these things are allowed, you must know for a fact that that every other kind of corruption and depravity is happening, is real. And that is why no one will be surprised if you hear about various legal types, members of the juristocracy, etc., who just happen to be also very much involved in pedophilia or other unspeakable things. You shouldn't be surprised, because these things always go together, and this must be understood. In other words, all the talk about what's the problem, two consenting adults, because eventually, first of all, we know two consenting adults quickly degenerates into one consenting adult and one non-consenting child, as we just said, for example, and every other form of prohibited behavior that you can imagine. But all the kind of talk and justification that, and it's always papered over and it's always repackaged. In other words, it's like the Chazon Ish is reported to have said with regards to Chilonim. He says, how can we even speak to these people? What we call kareth, they call love. It's always packaged. It's love. It's ahava. How can you be opposed to ahava, right? These two men claim that they love each other. So how can you be opposed to love, right? It's always possible to repackage and deliberately obfuscate the truth and the reality. But the fact is, when these things begin, it always ends up with stealing a vest and stealing everything else and doing every other possible abomination. The other perush that we should mention is that which appears, I believe for the first time, in the Sefer of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi HaKuzari. You have it here, I believe, correct? Here it is in the Ma'amar HaRishon in Sefer HaKuzari. Siman Sodi Hey. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi says as follows: He speaks about Adam Rishon and his descendants, and he says, this is in, as I say, Ma'amar Rishon Sadi He, Uchvar nikra ethlenu ben Elohim. Such a person who has this Thelem Elohim in the fullest sense is called a Ben Elohim by the Torah. V'hu v'chol mishe domeh lo mizar'o are known as Bnei Elohim. V'holid banim rabim v'lo haya mehem ra'ui liot b'mkom adam ela Hevel v'fi shu haya domeh lo. Only Hevel was the only child who was similar to Adam, and when he was killed by Cain, he had a third son, as we said, Sheth. V'haya lo lischula v'lev. He was the continuation of Adam. Uzulato, and the others keklipot ufsoleth, and the others are like the peel of that which is tossed away, as opposed to the fruit. And then from Sheth we have Enosh, etc., and so it comes down to Noach, and from Noach to Shem, and from Shem to Avraham, etc. In other words, what Rabbi Yehuda Halevi states here is very well known, that you have in humanity, you have those who are drawn and drawn to and created by Hashem with the facility and the ability and the desire to come closer to Hashem more than other people. There are basically two classes of people. This Perush of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi here is mentioned by the Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra. We have two Perushim from the Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra on these Pesukim, and he says as follows: B'nai Elohim Amar Rabbi Yehuda Halevi Ki hem b'nei Sheth shaya tzadik Uvnot ha'adam b'not Cain. In other words, we have these two kinds of people, and these two classes of humanity. Rav Hirsch, interestingly, also, without mentioning the Kuzari, writes about this in his Perush on Sefer Bereshit, in more or less the same terms. I quote to you from the translation into English of Rav Hirsch's Perush on the Torah, on Sefer Bereshit, chapter 6. Here we are shown the reason for the state of mankind growing worse as being due to the mixing of two classes, the Bnei Elohim and the Bnot HaAdam. And then he goes on to discuss the two lines of descendants. You have those who descend from Cain, and he describes them as people who strive to achieve in life something without God, without reference to Hashem. They strove to found a human existence on the basis of inventions and industry, but that did not end very well, as we know from what we find in the Torah explicitly about the descendants of Cain. The others, the descendants of Sheth, he says, this is the group which has, as he puts it, the divine stamp, the power and blessing of man's pure calling, which God had originally conferred, which is referred to in the Torah as Thelem and Beracha and Demuth Adam. This other line has a different focus in life and sees human existence in different terms. And he says explicitly, those who descended from Sheth and then later from Shem and later from Avraham, as we'll get to Avraham in a moment, they were the Bnei Elohim. And he goes on to say, when it says that Bnei Elohim, the descendants of Sheth, began to take note of the Bnot HaAdam, ki tovoth hena, good looking, Rav Hirsch writes, they did not look from whom they were descended, did not consider what children they could expect from mothers brought up in such environments. They simply looked at the girls and they appealed to them. The corruption did not lie in the women themselves, but in their descent. And the Torah stresses, as Rav Hirsch goes on to say, that it doesn't say anywhere in the Torah, as we said explicitly, it doesn't say anything about any act of kidnapping or anything of that sort, or taking things unlawfully. The sin on account of which, on account of the following verse, must of necessity be indicated in this verse, writes Rav Hirsch, would accordingly only have to be sought in the words Mikol Asher Baharu. They married girls without considering from where they were taking them. Therein lay the sin. The continuation of Shet in this world eventually was Avraham, and the Hidush with Avraham is Wa'esecha leroy gadol. From you, as opposed to everyone who's come before you, a specific and special and unique nation will spring. And of course, everything that we just read now applies to the descendants of Avraham even more so. In other words, later it's not surprising that we find in the Torah, Lo tithaten bam, do not marry anyone you find. That's not shayach, because you are of a different class, of a different type, you have a different focus and purpose in the world. And we find explicitly, as we know in the Talmud, Chachamim say that Yimkor Adam Kol Ma Sheyesh Lo V'Yisa Bath Tamid Chachamim. A man should sell everything that he has in order to marry the daughter of a Tamid Chachamim, because that is likely to have a major impact on the kind of home that we will have and the kind of children that he's likely to have, etc. That's not the only thing, but that's a very important first and fundamental step in creating a Jewish home and building one's life. And there's therefore no surprise. If you have Masechet Pesachim handy here somewhere, there are numerous statements. The statement I just quoted, you find in Pesachim in the Talmud Bavli Mem Tet Amud Bet at the top. Tenor Abanan le'olam yimkor adam kol ma sheyesh lo v'yisa bath tamid chachamim. It also goes on to say, just a few lines later, what should he do if he cannot find Bath Tamid Chachamim? Lo masa Bath Tamid Chachamim, yisa Bath Gedolei Ador. Rashi here explains Gedolei Ador refers to wealthy and righteous people who use their money correctly. Rashi says, Anshe Ma'aseh wa Sadikim. They may not be great Torah scholars, but they're righteous. They try to do the right thing. If they have lots of money, and Gedolei Ador, Gedolim usually refers to rich and wealthy and powerful people. That's what the term it means in other contexts. Here Rashi doesn't use the word, doesn't refer to wealth, but Rashi does say Anshe Ma'aseh with Sadikim. In other words, they do with their means, they use their worldly means for the right and correct and spiritual purposes. That's called Anshe Ma'aseh with Sadikim. If that one cannot find that kind of a daughter of such a person, Yisa Bath Rashei Nesiot. In other words, a person who's involved in running the Bet Knesset or the Bet Midrash or things of this nature. V'lo masa Bath Rashei Nesiot Yisa Bath Gaba'ei Tzedakah, because there's also someone who's dealing in important public work. In other words, work for the benefit of the klal. Lo masabath gabei tzedakah yisabath melamdei tinokot. A person who at least teaches chumash to children. It's also a great thing. Ulo yisabath amei haaretz mipnei shehen shekes. The daughters of amei haaretz should be treated as shekes. Rashi says here, mipnei shehen, the ben am haaretz are shekes, uneshothehem sheres. That's what it says. No one should. I'm only the messenger. Didn't write the message, but I subscribe to every word that it says here, and it's all true. And if someone doesn't like it, frankly, that's just too bad, because that's the reality. That's how the world is, and it's necessary that people know and understand how the world is and how they should view reality. And Rashi says, "Neshotzehem sheretz shenan zirot b'misvot, while benotzehem hu omer arul shochev in kol behema." fairly strong words, but there you have it. Rashi says, what does Rashi say? Im kol behema shedomoth lebehema she'en lehem lev lehavin. So it goes without saying that the descendants of Avraham Avinu, not only should they not intermarry with Ummot HaOlam, with the nations of the world, but even within Am Yisrael you have different levels and types of people. And we always have to aim for the connecting with the right people. And I think this Perush, even in terms of the Pshat of the Psukim, is, I would say, even more likely to be the Pshat than the other Perush, although they're both very possible in terms of the Pshat, because the term Elohim in the Torah appears more than once in the sense, in the context of a judge, a person who can give a judgment and can cause one person to be punished or to pay out or what have you. But the Perush here, وَيِرُوا بَنَيْ Elohim أَذْ بَنَوْتْ هَآدَمْ, clearly classifying humanity into two different classes: those who are drawn towards the more spiritual, to truth, to understanding, to knowledge, to wisdom, and connecting to the source of all things, to Hashem, and those who are, as we just saw in Rashi, Domoth Levehema. As it's not only Rashi, by the way, obviously it's Rashi, obviously it's Chazal, but even Plato understood this. You don't happen to have the Republic by Plato here, do you? All right, well, never mind. Well, I'll quote to you as what I recall. In Plato's book, The Republic, towards the end of Book 9, I believe, he explicitly, almost exactly says what we just learnt now. It's interesting how close to the Torah Plato was in many areas, in many points and arguments and perceptions and insights that he had. He's very much on target in many of those things. Not everything, obviously, but many things, yes. That's also a reason there's a connection between Neoplatonism and Kabbalah, for example, etc. That's another discussion, not for now. But there he says that there are two types of people: those who are drawn towards truth and wisdom and knowledge and appreciating things as they truly are. And he explains why their true joy and pleasure in life is understanding and wisdom and truth, and that they are much happier people than most human beings. Most human beings, he said, are like the beasts of the field. He says, when you see a cow, think of a cow, what do you see? You see this animal standing in the field with its head down, pointed at the ground. This is Plato, not me. Pointing at the head, pointed down, looking down at the earth, at the grass, at the hay that it's eating, and chewing away and nibbling all day long, and doing whatever else bulls and cows do, and that's it. That's the existence of the bovine species, correct, and all other animals essentially. And that is also true, he says, for most human beings, because they are drawn towards their physical needs and appetites, and this is what causes them to. This is what drives them to do whatever it is that they do in life, and this is what interests them, and they are always the majority. Most people are like that, and the minority are unique and different and special individuals. Of course, he refers to those people as philosophers. We refer to them as Hachamim. But the idea is not, these two ideas, these two descriptions are not terribly different. They're very, very similar. So when we think of the situation in the world today in terms of the intermarriage of young Jews around the world with non-Jews, it happens also here in Israel, unfortunately, but to a much lesser extent, because there are many non-Jewish people who others are not really aware of the fact that they're not Jewish. My information is that no more than 66% at the most of the population in this country today is halakhically Jewish. That's probably even an overstatement, but certainly no more than that. The official figure, by the way, is not that much different. The Israeli Bureau of Statistics, the Lamas, their official figure is 70% Jews. Used to be 72, 71. It's been going down a little bit over the last 20 years or so. Their official figure...
Like Arabs?
All non-Jewish, all non-Jews, including Arabs, within Israeli society, which today numbers something like 10.5 million or something like that, so I understand. So they list 70% as being non-Jews.
70 is non?
70% are listed as being Jews, and 30% as being non-Jews, okay? I'm saying that figure is not true, not by any stretch of the imagination, because there are many people who are listed officially as Jews who are clearly, without doubt, not Jewish according to Torah law, according to halakha. This refers particularly to people from the former Soviet Union who arrived with all kinds of forged or unclear documentation and managed to get themselves registered as Jews by Mishad Panim, the Ministry of the Interior. And very often it never comes to light, and you never know. So when so-and-so meets this young girl in the army, he's not to know that Alice is, her name's Alice. You might ask why her name's Alice, but all right, that's her name. He doesn't know that she's not Jewish. And then he decides he wants to marry her, and then all of a sudden he discovers that really her mother arrived here from Russia at some point. Maybe the father's Jewish, but the mother's not Jewish. Maybe only the grandfather was Jewish, who knows, but she's not Jewish. Now he'll say, well, I don't want to marry a non-Jew, we'll do a conversion, right? Well, yes, you could do a conversion, but what does a conversion mean? Let me quote again from Rabbi Yehuda Halevi in the Kuzari. It's not only here that you'll find what I'm about to say, but let's read it from here, because the book is in front of us. Rambam says the same. He says here, in Siman Kof Tethwal, 115, also Mamar Rishon in the Kozari, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi writes, "V'anachnu lo nashwa im asmenu kol mi shenichnas ledatenu b'mila bilevad." There's not enough for a person who wishes to join us, the Jewish people and the Jewish faith. It's not enough to be circumcised. Ela b'ma'asim sheyesh b'hem amal hanefesh. In other words, this requires effort, many types of behavior and religious practice. Ketahara Walimud umila uma'asim torim rabim. In other words, all manner of mitzvot. It includes Talmud Torah and being shomer tumah b'tahara, such as nida, and of course milah and many other things. And in one word, uvahat shinhar kavin harenu. In other words, a ger tzedek has to be noheg k'yehudi, which means katorah. There's no other definition of giur in the Torah. And that is not usually the case. And when that is not the case, there was no giur. So there's Rabbanim, and there are such people, strangely, who somehow want to turn a blind eye to this fact and as it were, convert all kinds of people who have no intention of living according to the Torah. And why would they? Their boyfriend doesn't do it, so why would they do it? Or the other way around. It makes no difference. And they live on a Hinoni kibbutz that raises pigs in the Galil, shall we say? Why on earth would she? Why would you assume that she's a means to accept the Torah in any way, shape, or form, even for a week? If that's the case, there was no giur. But if you claim that is a giur, it's even worse, because you're being machshil. You are causing the blind to stumble, because they will think, wow, she's Jewish, it says so, she has a tudah, she has a piece of paper, it says she's a gioreth, but she's not, or he's not, because there was no giur. It's all a fiction. So the problems are immense. I understand that today in Chutz La'aretz, intermarriage is something like 90% in most parts of the world. And this is a calamity beyond words. But again, even within Am Yisrael, there are levels and classes and categories of people, as we just saw explicitly in the Talmud, the Masechet Pesachim Daf Mem Teth. And this is brought in the Rambam, it's brought in the Shulchan Aruch. Wherever you look, it's there. There's nothing new about this. Nothing. No one should be surprised. Another thing we should point out, and I wanted to point out, is that when this Pasmarith, so-called Pasarith, this Advocate General, staged suicide the other day, which in some ways one could say did not turn out to be factual, unfortunately. On the other hand, I may retract that statement because it's possible that we will get more information out of her about others as long as she's still breathing, and that's one reason at least to be perhaps even upbeat about the fact that she's still breathing. But most definitely she is not worthy to breathe fresh air. There's no question about that, because for those who don't know what these people have been up to, for example, in case it was unclear, we shall make it very clear right now and say as follows. Anyone who has any understanding and is following various events has seen this and known this to be true for years. But we now know for a fact that as part of the Kaplan woke progressive types. By the way, this Advocate General, what was her previous job before she was so-called head of the military justice system? She was an advisor, the Yoamlan it's called or something. She was the advisor to the chief of staff on gender matters, gender issues. They should know that's the most regressive, that is to say progressive, the most regressive job in the entire army. So you get an idea of who we're talking about. But she and her ilk, their aim was to bring down this current government, which, as hopeless as it is better than the alternative, just as difficult as it is to say that, but it's true. When I say the alternative, I mean the obvious, apparent real-world alternatives, not the real alternatives. And they were willing to do this by any means possible. It's also today absolutely clear that there was no question, there were many deliberate acts of treason, of begrida, against the Jewish people that led to this war, and from the outbreak of the war, and since that time down to the present day, there is a certain individual who has actually proved this scientifically. I will send out the link to some information about this, and you can hear it for yourself. These people planned and knew of an invasion. They didn't apparently realize how serious it would be, but they were happy for there to be an invasion that they would then contain, that would be quite serious, in order to bring the government down. And when that didn't work exactly, they tried to stop the war by arresting and interrogating soldiers on trumped-up charges of different types. The classic example being these 5 soldiers, I think, from Koach Mea in the State Teman prison, military prison, where the actual Islamic Nazis who invaded this country and committed all those unspeakable acts are all housed. Not one of whom has gone on trial, interestingly enough. So they took this criminal act of taking these 5 soldiers, claiming that they sexually abused and raped this one of these Islamic Nazis, which is not true, which this Arab himself said never happened, but was forced by the Shabak to say that it did. We know this also. He was also, this particular Islamic Nazi was released into Gaza secretly without anyone knowing on the 13th of October, by the way. This became known yesterday. You can ask yourself why, but that's the fact. The purpose of that and similar efforts was to increase international pressure on Israel to bring an end to the war. We also know further, again, I'm not going into all the details now, but we know for a fact that the extremely evil influence peddler, the non-entity Joe Biden, he was particularly interested in this State Teman case, and they were reporting to him all the time. And in the court, there was an American, apparently a CIA person, sitting there with a laptop, constantly hitting his keys, reporting upstairs as to the goings on. We all know this. Some of this became only known yesterday, but it's a fact. These are all deliberate acts of sabotage and treason, which meant, also due to various other positions that this Advocate General and her minions have taken, and of course the so-called Supreme Court, the result of all this was that we could not fight the war and win, which we haven't, because we were prevented from doing so for multiple reasons, all of which essentially can be placed at the doorstep of this juristocracy, of these erevra, which I want to speak about also in a moment. Now, when she staged her suicide the other night, some people on the right who despised this person all of a sudden changed their tune. Oh, it's very tragic, it's very sad, because they really thought they were already eulogizing her. They thought that she had already done away with herself. It became apparently an hour or two later that was not the case, but they were all already just expressing sorrow and what a tragedy and all sorts of things. Well, I just want to read to you what Rambam says here in Ilchot Evel, Perek Aleph. Kol ha-porashim midarkei tzibur, Jews who turn their back on the Jewish people. And what is that? Rambam explains. Wahem ha'anashim sheparaku ol ha'mitzvot mi'al savaran. This refers to people who turn their back on the Torah and say it doesn't apply to me, it doesn't interest me, I don't believe it, whatever it is, without taking into account all the possible reasons why a person might think this right now, because if a person was brought up in that fashion, that might explain why they think so. But Rambam goes on to explain further. In other words, they want nothing to do with anything the Jews do. They view themselves as free agents, willing and happy to do whatever they please, like any other human being, and they have no particular affinity for the Jewish people. And we see that this is the kind of people that we're discussing, these legal advisors and judges and all these types. And similarly, haminim u'hameshumadim u'hamasoroth. So this woman that we've been mentioning, she's obviously and meshumedet, and musereth, and everything else that you can mention here. Kol elu en mithabelim alehim. When they die, their relatives are not required to mourn for them, as a Jew normally is required to mourn for one of his relatives. In other words, like a parent or a brother, a child. Ela ahehen ushal krovehen, their family, immediate family, and their other relatives. Lovashim levanim, they are to put on festive clothing. Umit atfim levanim, u'ochelim u'shothim, and they are to celebrate. Usmehim she'avadu sana'o shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and they are to express their joy that haters of Hashem have met their downfall. Olahem HaKatuv Omer halo mesanecha Adonai esna. That's what Rambam writes here, based on explicit words of Chazal, and no one should be surprised, of course, by that. And people who have a problem with that, or any difficulty with digesting such information, need to look themselves in the mirror and ask themselves, on what do you base your particular set of values and sensitivities? On what? It's not based on the Torah. It's based on thinking in non-Jewish terms. That's what it's all about. Almost all these questions that we're discussing come down to one thing and one thing only. Are you thinking in Torah terms or in anything but Torah terms? I will quote to you also from something that Rav Kook writes in Einaya on the Agadah, which we find in Masechet Barachot Daf Yod. It says as follows: Amar la hahu mina. It should say mina or mina'a. In some printings, like here, it says sadoki, which is censorship, but it should say mina or mina'a. So I was referring to one of the early Christians who were familiar with the Tanakh, and they like to cause grief to various Jews by coming and asking all kinds of questions. Why do you say this? The Pasuk says this, and what have you. So one of them once was speaking to Berulia, the wife of Rabbi Meir. It says, Roni akara lo yalada. Why does that? It doesn't make any sense. Why would a woman who's childless, why would she rejoice? Roni akara lo yalada, mishum de lo yalada roni. Doesn't make any sense. It should be the opposite. So she explained to him, no, you have to understand. Roni Knesset Yisrael shedoma leisha akara. Am Yisrael, Knesset Yisrael is like a childless woman. Shelo yalada banim legenom kawathaychu. Who does not bring into this world people who are destined for a bitter end and for hell, such as you people. Rav Kook writes about this as follows. He says, in general, it's not a bad thing there are different types of people, different groups and parties in a nation, because they all try to, if they're all trying to promote certain good ideas and ideologies in which they believe, that's a good thing. In that case, it's possible that the various groups and factions and ideologies each have something to contribute to the overall benefit of society. Ki kol miflaga meshachleret miktsua miyuchad shemu'il avodat haklal ushlemutho. Each group can bring something to the table that is beneficial to Klal Yisrael. Omnam kol ze eno medubar ki im b'shitot u'miflagot ka'ele. But this only refers to those kinds of groups or parties or factions she'enan nogaot b'hayei ha'am ha'ikari laharso. This is true as long as we're not talking about an ideology or a faction whose purpose it is and whose ideology it is to destroy Am Yisrael spiritually. Aval hakitot hara'oth or hakatot hara'oth ha'umudot b'Yisrael lifamim lahares Torah u'miswa. But those whose ideology is to undermine the Torah, shehen bet hayehem shel Yisrael, which is the bedrock of Am Yisrael's existence and their very destiny and purpose on earth. Hen einan noladot miteva ruach haklali shel ha'am. Such groups cannot be the result of a normal, natural process within the Jewish people. Como shar katot u'miflagot ha'mo'ilot l'shichlul v'hitpatchuth. Ki hakatot ha'norot b'hayehem shel Yisrael, those who wish to lasum eva ben Yisrael avihem shebashamayim, those who wish to cause a divorce and distancing of Am Yisrael from Hashem, levatel achdutham shel Yisrael u'kedushatam al yedei merida b'Torah bichlal, by encouraging and promoting a general revolt against the Torah. La'aspik b'yarden echar b'de'ot ra'ot v'zarot shehen kerekev l'Yisrael, to adopt those ideas and ideologies which deny the Torah, which deny Am Yisrael's purpose and meaning and essence. These things are like a rot, like a cancer. Kerekev l'Yisrael. Hen einan porachot miruach ha'am ha'panimi ha'amiti k'shar miflagot mu'ilot. They cannot be considered a natural outgrowth of the Jewish people, like as other factions may be considered. Wa'en b'choach Knesset Yisrael kalal loholid gidulim ra'im u'ma'ararim ka'ele. Am Yisrael, Knesset Yisrael, the true Am Yisrael, cannot bring into this world such people. Rak miruach mashhith hisoni noladu. Such people can only come from without. על כן, לא יתדבקו בישראל להיות עצם מעצמי האומה. And such people therefore will never be truly joined onto the Jewish people. כי אם בהכינם להם מפלגה ושיטת כיתה מסוירת. The only way they can exist is to create for themselves some breakaway movement, like the Christians. We're talking here about the Minim, who were the early Christians. So either that referred to certain Jews who adopted this newfangled religion at that time, or non-Jews who had adopted that system. Jews who adopt such a system, when they must break away from the Jewish people, because everything they stand for is the opposite of what Am Yisrael stands for. And therefore they break away from the Jewish people and they join forces with the Goyim, because they don't belong to Hashem, they don't come from Hashem, they're not part of Klal Yisrael. As it says in Masechet Beisa, Daf Lamed Daled, when a certain Chacham saw the behavior of certain Jews in Bavel, he said, these are not real Jews, they're Erev Rav. Because there are certain signs, certain behaviors, certain ideologies which mean that it has to be from that. Or misitra de Erev Rav. In other words, they come from a contaminated spiritual source, not from the trunk of the tree of Am Yisrael, and neither are they a branch thereof. Therefore, Rav Kook ends this section. He says, "Al ken yardei sheker kaele," such people who are opposed to everything that Am Yisrael stands for. Simcha hi leknesset Yisrael she'en betiv'a loholid banim le'enom kavataychu. We are pleased that such people cannot be truly part of us. U'lo miknesset Yisrael nolavtem ki im miruach zadon o sichlut hanish'av miberot nishbarim zarim. Al ken iyevshar lehem litkayim beYisrael. And therefore such people, because they can only come from such foreign broken wells, as Rav Kook writes, which is based on the famous pasuk, in the end they will find their way out of Am Yisrael. They will separate from Am Yisrael, just as the Minim did, and as all kinds of Jewish communists 150 and 100 years ago did. As we know, the greatest anti-Semites are turncoat Jews, as the expression is in Yiddish. A meshumad is schlecht wie a goy, right? A meshumad is worse than a Gentile who just hates Jews because that's what you have to do, right? You know what a definition of a British anti-Semite is? A British gentleman who's an anti-Semite. That's a British gentleman who hates Jews more than absolutely necessary. So you expect that kind of hatred from Gentiles, because Hasina Yardam Yahar Sinai Lam Yisrael, as the Gemara says. In other words, the nations of the world, mostly, for the most part, have a problem with the Jewish people and the Torah that they bear in the world, and their testimony that they bear in this world. Of course, there are good Gentiles, and there are those Gentiles who know the truth and who appreciate Am Yisrael for what it is and wish to help Am Yisrael in every way. And in some cases they want to convert, or they want to be B'nai Noach, or what have you. There are such people, no question. I know such people. And I'm happy and proud to know such people. But that's not the general rule, as we know. Within Am Yisrael also, if you find such people who are so obviously willing to bring calamity and all manner of evil, and to peddle all manner of iniquity in order to for their own personal benefit, or to join forces with enemies of the Jewish people, etc. Such people must be from the Erev Rav, as Rav Kook writes here, as the Gemara says in Masechet Beisa. And we have to know that these people are not our brothers, not our friends. They are our enemies. Yehi ratzon sheHashem yishmerenu v'yasilenu mikol oyevenu mibayit u'michutz. May Hashem save us from all our enemies and foes, and detractors, domestic, foreign and domestic, as the American expression is. במהרה בימינו, חזקו ויאמץ לבבכם, כל המייחלים לאדוני. שלום וניצחון.